Welcome to another episode of the Impossible Life Podcast. I'm your co-host, Nick Surface, and I'm sat across from a man who recently took a personality profile test only for the results to come back as inconclusive. That's right, friends, the former Navy SEAL, Garrett Unkelbach, a man who refuses to fit in a box.
I love that.
Yeah.
I received that one.
You know, and that's actually true for you because...
Was that you or is that a listener submission?
Okay, there's a fine example of Garrett just being, obstinate, like always. Yeah, that's my own, dude, like most of these things, okay? It's about time you start.
You did a good job for once.
Okay. Anyways, I'm glad you can. If you're watching this, you can see the smile Garrett has on his face. So the reason that whole intro comes because Garrett really is one of these people. If you tell him what to do, his natural reaction is to do the opposite.
Now that you're saying I have to do it, I don't want to do it anymore.
Right.
I actually wanted to do it, but because you said I have to, I don't want to anymore.
Which amazes me that you were in the military and you were good at your job. Like that would have seemed like the last thing you should have ever done.
It's not natural to me. But you know what? So many people in the SEAL program are exactly the same way.
Really?
It was founded by JFK in 1962 as a guerrilla war fighting force, and it is people who do not fight conventionally. At that point in history in Vietnam, so many people were dying because of conventional fighting. And he said, we need to get the rule breakers in here to change things up. And so that's really, it's like the origin of who the SEALs are. So it is a funny part of it's a painful part of SEAL culture, how like even within the SEAL program, it's like, hey, do this and do what we say. But at the same time, it's a bunch of people who are like, I'm not doing what you told me to do. Right. So you really have to understand that line of like bucking the system, but serving the mission.
Right. Yeah. Well, anyways,
it's a fine point.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I get to walk that, alongside you and watch you basically be a jerk to me all the time. So it's fun. Anyways.
It's good for you.
Yeah, it is good for me. Now, today, on the day of this release, is the 3rd of July, which means that we are only...
By the time you're listening to this or soon thereafter is 4th of July.
It's 4th of July, and we are going to be talking about that. It also means that we're only 3 days away from Mindset Mastery starting.
I'm excited about that.
I'm excited about that too. We've been putting a lot of hours of work into it. First subject is principles, priorities, and order. I will tell you that Garrett... I'm watching him kind of push to a different level as far as the content that he's putting together as the instructor for the course. Just one thing to say for people. Look, I know we've talked a lot about this, and you may be like, okay, we get it, man, like mindset mastery, whatever. The reason that we're so passionate about this, and I'm going to speak more for myself than for Garrett, I know what it is to be a person who's living far below your potential, when you wake up and every day feels the same, and you don't feel a sense of purpose, you feel trapped, you're going around in circles and you don't really know how to make it change. You want it to change, but you don't know what to do. And I've been there, man. I've been depressed. I've been through so much pain. And the biggest pain to me was living without purpose. And I suspected when I was in that state that there was something better, and I just didn't know how to find it. I was looking for things. I loved Tony Robbins because I felt like I got a modicum of what I was looking for from him. And it wasn't until I was God worked some miracles, truthfully, to get us here to Dallas, Texas, and I became part of the culture that we have here at Elevate Life Church, and obviously then got to meet Garrett and see the way he lived, that I identified, and I said, oh my gosh, this guy lives in a way that I've never seen before, and it was a experience that I'd never had before. And the reason I'm so passionate, and the reason I will always be passionate and be working at this for the rest of my life, truly as a mission, is because I know what it is to be in that pain and to be living so far below the standard and what God has for us as people. And I don't want anyone else to be in that. And Mindset Mastery is the beginning of us giving that to people to truly show you, hey, God made you to win and he made you for so much more. The things you hear on this podcast all the time, how to put them into action so that you can truly walk in, wake up every day, know that you have purpose, know who you are, know where you're going, and knowing why you're there. And when you can walk in with that sort of certainty, you can say, this is the way that God designed it, and this is the way I'm going to go out and make it to be because he made me to do that. And it's powerful. So if there's anything in there that I just said that resonated, please come join us. Honestly, we want to help people know God. We want to help people change their lives and live to all that they're made to be. We need to change this world, guys. And it's not going to happen by us hoping for somebody else. We're going to have to be the change. So that's all I'll say about Mindset Mastery.
It's extremely well said, and thank you. That's also very honoring. I'll just add one thing. If you are listening to this and it's, weeks, months, or even years later, just know that you can join us in Mindset Mastery at any time. You don't have to join us before the launch. We want you to join us before the launch so you can be with us from day one. Also, you earn a really cool shirt for joining us before launch. But if it's August or September or whatever time you're listening to this after this episode, just know that you can still join us.
Yes, very good. Now, like we said, this is the 3rd of July. So today's episode is on freedom. But not freedom in the sense of like we're going to give you a history lesson or anything like that. We're going to look at...
We may pull out a couple pieces of history, but...
Well, yeah, for sure.
Purpose.
But what we want to look at is... It's interesting because we're all sat here in America and around the world, and we know we have listeners all over the world. They're aware of what this day means to America. Now, what's the interesting thing is we're all celebrating something that we were born into, that people paid the price to do hundreds of years ago.
That's right.
Lots of generations that we get to be the beneficiaries of, right? We are the beneficiaries of the price that they paid. So one of those key forefathers, Benjamin Franklin. What a guy, right? Like, you talk about a guy who really made it happen for this country, fought the good fight. I mean, I think he was 61 years old whenever he really started engaging in it, and, you know, key figure throughout.
He was a mental warrior for this country.
Big time, yeah. And just, I mean, some of the quotes he has out there are just phenomenal. So you think, man, what a warrior of a man. Well, interestingly enough, Benjamin Franklin had 2 sons. Unfortunately, one of them that was born in his marriage died of smallpox at a young age. I believe he died at 4. Well, William Franklin was the son of Benjamin Franklin, and it was his extramarital son. Really interesting, because I talk about what you're born into and the beneficiary of, and we're going to come back to why this is important. So you would think, okay, your dad's Ben Franklin, passionate conversations. Okay, you're not in the home, but at least you're going to hear about what he's into. Oh, wait. William Franklin was actually a loyalist, and like a hardcore loyalist. He was actually based in New York, and he was imprisoned by patriots from 1776 to 1778, and he was the chief leader of the loyalists from his base in New York City. He would organize military units to fight on the British side, and in 1872, he went into exile in Britain, and he lived in London until his death.
Wow. I wonder how much of that was just out of spite for his father. You said 1872. Is that 1782?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I flipped the number. 1782. Good catch. Yes. Yeah, 1782. That's exactly my point, right? Because clearly there's got to be more to that story of like, hey, you're my dad, but you weren't married to my mom.
It's no coincidence that, you know, the son of Benjamin Franklin is one of the leaders of the Loyalists.
Yeah. So when Benjamin Franklin's like fighting for freedom, he's fighting against his son. Yeah, I figured you'd enjoy that. Now, why are we telling you that? Because all of us, one way or another, are born into slavery or to bondage or to freedom, right? Yeah. And for a lot of us, there's areas where it's both.
In this country and in our lives, you know, we're born into, like, just to be born into America is an incredible privilege. Even in today, where people have this skewed mindset of like, you know, America's not what it used to be and all those things, that it's an incredible privilege to be born into this country. But there's also things, regardless of where you live in this world, right? Even if you don't live in America, you're born in some ways born into freedom, and in other ways born into bondage. For a lot of people, that's just money, right? They think being born into money is freedom, being born into poverty is bondage. But there's a lot of different ways besides money that you can be born into freedom or bondage.
Yes, and we're going to get into that. But before we do, G, I don't want to just slander the man, because he did play a great part. Great quote from Benjamin Franklin. Any society that will give up a little liberty to gain a little security will deserve neither and lose both.
That's right. Say that again.
Any society that will give up a little liberty to gain a little security will deserve neither and lose both.
There's a principle really about the understanding of freedom versus security. And it's things that Congress talks about all the time. Laws revolve around this, around how much of because a lot of people are like, well, around rules with the government institutions that monitor us and all these things. Congress has pried into this. Well, some people feel like, well, I would rather, like have people look at my text messages and just know that like I'm safe because I don't have anything to hide.
Right.
And then there's other people that's more on the security side. You have other people who are like, no, we should all have, freedom and privacy, right? And that's less on the security side. And you give one thing up for the other. I won't go like deep into that, but if you study that, if you're into technology, if you're into logic, you'll understand that there actually is you cannot break that. As you increase in freedoms, you give up security, right? Like think about if you like, I want to make sure nobody could ever like steal from me, right? Like I'm going to lock my, like Fort Knox, right? Like extremely secure. How easy is it to move gold in and out of Fort Knox? Takes a lot of work to get in there and move that stuff out. Not a lot of freedom. Versus like if you just want to like carry money around in your wallet, it's a lot of freedom, right? Not a lot of security,
right?
So this is it's a principle. You cannot change it. These things, as you increase in one, you decrease in the other.
I'm guessing your wallet's pretty secure, but
different types of security.
Yeah, we don't all have your level of crazy and training. So that's it.
And there actually is a dynamic to that. Like there's personal freedoms or subjugated or substituted freedoms, personal security versus substituted security, right? Like your ability to defend yourself versus if I can't, and I've asked someone else to do that for me, that's where you give up freedom. That's a different topic, but it's funny that you brought that up.
Yeah, well, I was just making a joke, but thanks for taking everything so seriously. Anyways, so we're throwing around the word freedom here, G, and we've talked about how we're all beneficiaries. That this is a real what we want to point out, this is a real generational thought process here, right? The same way that we highlight that you're born into a free country because of what people did before you, you were born into a lineage in your family, right? And that's a generational thought process. Likewise, hopefully you're going to reproduce and people are going to be born in and be the beneficiary of the prices that you've paid. So it's something important to think of. Now, we're going to come back to that. So I'm just going to lay that down for right now. We're throwing around the freedom like it's something that people all understand, but we're going to break out our trustee.
Yeah, to a lot of people, freedom is just, I get to do whatever I want.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Like, and honestly, that's the immature understanding of freedom, right? Like teenagers, like, you know, they just want freedom. And what they think freedom is that their parents aren't telling them what to do anymore.
Right. Like you remember when you first turned 18, you're like, I'm going to stay out to whatever I want. And,
when you first turn 16 and you get a car and you think, oh, this is freedom, that I can drive wherever I want and do whatever I want.
Until the cops nail you for curfew, speaking from experience. Anyways, but the definition of freedom...
Have you ever been arrested?
No, dude. Have you?
Absolutely not.
Huh. I actually expected you to say yes there. Probably for something random, like, you know, choking a bear with your bare hands.
You'd have to catch me to arrest me.
Okay. Should have known. Anyways, going to our trusty Webster's 1828 dictionary for the definition of freedom: a state of exemption from the power or control of another. And then we added our own definition to that. And what we said was the point of freedom is to do the right thing and the best thing, not to do whatever you feel like in the moment. And that was very much what our forefathers had in mind whenever they were building this country.
Yeah, if you think about why this country was founded, right? They didn't like, man, let's go to a new land so we can do whatever we want. Right? Let's go to a new land because in this country, in Great Britain, we're being controlled, we're being kept from being able to do what we know and believe is right. Right? So the definition of freedom is a state of exemption from power or control of another. Right. So and that in the context of this country, people were coming to America so that they could be free from the king's rule and the king's control. In that same way, like we're not so much talking about like American freedoms today. We're talking about like your freedom within your life. And so many people, whether it's in their family or it's in their way of thinking, they're born into bondage in a way. These things control me. You think and this is really a powerful way of thinking. Like you think freedom is I can do whatever I want. Well, sometimes whatever you want to do is actually just what your body's telling you want to do.
Yes.
What the wrong parts of your mind are telling you want to do. And so you think you're free, but really you're in bondage to your flesh. You're in bondage to unforgiveness. You're in bondage to anger. Right? Like freedom is not like I can just assault people whenever I want. Freedom is not I can sleep with whoever I want.
Yes.
Freedom is not I can take whatever I want.
Right.
Like you're in bondage to the wrong things. And so we say that to say what we're getting into, what we're introducing, what we want to grow from today is really having a right understanding of what freedom is, how to live with it, and how to maintain it.
Yeah, for sure. And well, you touched on it there, G. I mean, default is bondage. Yep. And I mean, the definition of bondage, according to Webster's, is slavery or involuntary servitude. And what's the most deceptive involuntary servitude is, like you said, doing things that you think are making you free. Like, I'm going to hook up with whoever I want, man. I can sleep with whoever I want. And aren't I so free? Well, good luck turning that one off when you start getting into some bad habits, right? I mean, we've talked before about, and we don't need to go into examples.
I think it's interesting, the thought, too, that bondage is the default.
Right.
I don't have any stats on this, but you can just study history and understand this. Whether it's the Israelites, whether it's slavery and bondage at any point in history, if you think about the amount of people that were taken from, like, I was born free, but then sold into slavery, that amount of people versus the amount of people that were children of slaves born into slavery.
Yeah.
Right? Like, just let's look at the Israelites, for example. Right? Like, you have one generation who, of Israelites who are born free and become slaves in Egypt. 400 years of slavery. How many more generations is that of slavery of people who were born into it? Right. And so many of us have bondages in our life that we were born into, right? Like these things were passed down to us from our parents or people in our life that put something on us, that they either hurt us or did something to us that put us into bondage, right? So much bondage is passed on to us, not necessarily that we just fall into it. Right. So that's the understanding of that bondage is a default. Right. And also you may have freedoms today, but if you stop doing the right things, you'll find yourself in bondage.
Now I'm glad you said that, because But what bondage looks like modern day for us, I mean, you talked about you will be born into it. It's not like the Pharaoh of Egypt saying, hey, you have to be here to make bricks and straw at a certain time.
By the way, I just want to, because I think it's really important, not that it's the purpose of this podcast, but I think it's very important. I want to note that there's actually more people in slavery today than ever in human history. It's an invisible war that's going on of sex slavery, right? And there's a really great movie that comes out on July 4th called The Sound of Freedom. I would encourage everybody to go see that movie with, why did I just blank on his name, from The Passion of the Christ?
Oh, Jim Caviezel.
Yeah, Jim Caviezel is the main character in The Sound of Freedom, and it's about this invisible war of slavery.
Yeah, there's 49 million people modern day born into slavery, which is just mind-blowing. It's disgusting. Anyways,
so please go see that movie, The Sound of Freedom.
Now, the bondage that we're talking about, apart from that, is like you said, it's the one that you're born into. That's not the king of Egypt or Pharaoh saying, "Hey, you have to make bricks." This comes in the form of patterns of behavior and mindset, massively in mindset. So, what do people end up being a slave to? It's their subconscious. It's their automatic programs that they're running and things, which for a lot of people is substance abuse. Like, oh, this is what my dad did. This is what I watched him do. And this is a very learned behavior. It's cravings. It's emotions. They're in bondage to finance. A lot of people are in bondage to comfort. I would say they're so comfortable that they can't get out of that and actually push themselves past that. And a big one, especially for men, is insecurity and the need for validation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's one that you will see. And what I mean by that, because you'll be like, well, what do you mean? Well, insecurity.
It's a crazy thing to think about, but you're in bondage to yourself.
Yes.
Right? Like, we were actually born with a purpose, born to be free as children of God, right? But when you don't know God, when you don't know who you are in him, you're going to have this insecurity from a lack of a father who's a beneficiary or a benefactor in your life that you can be the beneficiary of, who shows you what freedom is. Mm-hmm. And so you find yourself in this place of insecurity where you're in bondage to yourself. You're in bondage to a way of thinking that is bound to this world, which is really not who you're supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah, big time. And that insecurity will, and this is how it works, right? So we're saying these things. If your parents haven't figured something out, chances are it's going to be passed down to you to either figure out, or you're going to pass it right on down to your kids, which is why you see like generational alcoholism, you see generational abuse, you see all these different things. When I was talking about insecurity, for a lot of people, if they didn't have a parent, specifically the father, because it's the father's job to give the identity to the kids, that told them who they were, they're going around and looking for it from other places. And when I talk about validation and insecurity for men specifically, you need to feel like a man or feel like you're good enough. So what do? It's about the job or the chick that you got to hook up with. And that makes you feel, oh, I'm the man. And guess what? The feeling fades. Now you got to go find another thing to give you that feeling again. Mm-hmm. And you are constantly going from one thing to another, trying to basically prove to yourself or prove to whatever ideal you have in your head that you're good enough. And you know what? As long as you're doing that, you never will get there. And people spend their entire lives doing that. And they get to their old age. And by that point, they have such ingrained bad habits that they don't get out of them. They almost celebrate them. And it's a complete waste of the purpose of their life.
So the first step is you got to really be aware of these things that Nick is talking about. Like, understand that this is actually bondage. It's not that I can do whatever I want is freedom, that I'm in bondage to all these wrong things. And then looking at your life and saying, okay, like, what are the things that I was actually born into bondage in, right? Like, and you've got to get past that with your family and your parents, like, because they didn't have it all figured out. You don't have it all figured out. But like, what are the things that my family I was born into bondage because of that. And I got to make sure that I'm going to do that for my children, that they're not going to be born into that same bondage. Because just like when you look at this country, you hear it all the time, and I'll use a great presidential quote here in a second about it. But you see it all the time in this country that we have to continually fight for freedom to maintain freedom, because it's not the default.
Yes.
Bondage is the default. We will find our way back into sin. We will find our way back into bondage. So we have to be the ones, every single one of us, every single person listening to this podcast, for ourselves, for our family, for our future legacy, and even for this country, for some of us, you have to do your part to make sure that freedom is allowed to grow, right? Because if you don't, if you step back, freedom will diminish and freedom will disappear. It was Ronald Reagan who said that we are never more than one generation away from the extinction of freedom.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true. And so that's not just an American thing. That's a thing for your family, right? If you stop doing it, like, you could have been born into freedom, but if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you'll bear your children into bondage.
Yeah. And when we talked, I just want to highlight before we move on, because we are going to teach you how to fight. We're going to talk about how to fight for freedom and the things that you must do. We talked about it being patterns of behavior and mindsets. One of the big things that will be passed down for people is a poverty mindset. And the way that you can tell, okay, well, how do I know what bondage I've been born into? Here's a real simple way. God made you to win. He sets you up and he designs you to be fruitful, right? To multiply, to fill the earth, to have dominion. If there's areas of your life that there's dysfunction, it's going to be because somewhere you are out of line with the way that God intended things to be. There will be thought processes that you've accepted, like a poverty mindset, that is not biblical. And that may sound like, oh, okay, that's simple. Well, it's not simple. You do need to know what the Word of God says. And that's how you're going to be able to start to identify, hey, what was handed down to me that was commonly accepted, something that we just did, that actually whenever you lay it next to the Word of God doesn't line up.
If there's hard in your life that you're not choosing, that might be an indicator of bondage.
Boom.
When you are free, you go out and choose hard to maintain that free. When you're in bondage, difficult things are put upon you, and you hate them, you run from them. Why is this being given to me? And you continue to maintain that. Right. And that's one indicator of the difference between freedom and bondage.
Man, I love that. So what you saw Garrett do right there was summarize what I was trying to say very efficiently. So well done, G. That's your superpower. All right, G, we're fighting for freedom.
Yeah.
There's two real areas, right? Step one is freedom from the past. We've started to touch on it, right?
Yep.
And you described this like covering the holes.
Yeah. So, you maybe you're in a hole in your life. Either you were born in that hole as your dad's hole and now it's your hole, or you dug this hole yourself. But you've got to get out of that hole. And then the important part, this is also for your business, right? Like this is a thing for your family. That's mostly what we're talking about. But you also run into these things in your business, right? Like there's potholes all over the place, and some of them aren't just potholes; they're like car size holes.
Yeah.
And like a hole that'll swallow up a man or destroy a vehicle. You got to climb out of those holes, and then don't just move on down the road. You got to cover those holes up. You got to fill them back in. You got to put some over the top of them. Don't let somebody fall into the same well that you fell into.
Yeah, no, that's good, G. And part of this process, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, is forgiveness.
Yeah.
Right? Man, I would love to walk you through a 6-step process of why this works psychologically. But I mean, really, this is just where you have to trust what the Word of God says. And there's so much other stuff. You could talk to people who don't, who are just counselors or whatever that aren't biblical, and they'll tell you the same thing. Forgiveness is so powerful. And I'm not just talking about forgiving people that have hurt you or forgiving your own parents or wounds of the past. You also have to forgive yourself, because there's sometimes that you'll look back and you'll realize that you are repeating a pattern of behavior that you learned from your parents, and you'll naturally feel shame and guilt. And the truth is you've got to look at that and go, you know what? At the time, I didn't realize what I was doing, and I have to forgive myself. Personally, I think that was the most difficult step, is to forgive yourself for things you've done in the past. But until you do it, you will not be released from it. You will keep nursing.
You'll be out of the hole, but in your mind, you'll still be in the hole.
Yeah.
And if I could add something to this, if we're just talking about what it takes to cover up the hole, it's forgiveness, but it's also awareness. And those are two things to have those are two things that are difficult to have at the same time. Right. Most people think like forgive and forget. Right. Like maybe there's like metaphorically, you live on a farm and there's just a random well on the property. There's a little boy, like you walked and fell into that hole. It's like, why didn't anybody tell me that was there? Why wasn't that covered up? Like, obviously, your parents probably knew that hole was there and they just let it happen to you.
Right.
Right. And like, you can live your whole life like mad about that. And like that mangled my leg and like I'm scarred with this for forever. Right. You've got to get past that, but then you've also got to like have awareness around that and make sure that no one else falls into the same pit that you fell into. And I understand that's a part of your story. And just like the Word says, God can use that for good. If you take this struggle that's in your life, you have the right attitude about it, and you let God develop it into endurance in your life.
Yeah, that's so good.
So forgiveness and awareness.
Yeah. And you touched about it, like in that example you gave of the farm, it was the parents who let you fall in. And that's a lot. I mean, okay, people don't live on farms and fall in holes. I'm guessing that's not the majority of our audience, but there will be. What I've noticed is people are very quick. A lot of times people are angry about things that their parents did or didn't do.
Yeah.
Right. And like rightly or wrongly, I can't go into specific details, but rightly or wrongly, you have to realize all parents are amateur parents, and there's some gross neglect and abuse, and that's completely different. I'm not
Hindsight's
talking about
20/20. It's easy to say what you should have done after you've already been through all of it.
Correct. I'm not talking about gross neglect or abuse. I'm talking about those things where you're like, oh, my parents should have known better about this. They never showed me how to do this. They never told me this. They weren't very good at finance, whatever, and all these different things that you're kind of pinning on your parents. And it's like, hey, every parent ever is an amateur parent, right? We don't have professional parents. And guess what? You're going to be an amateur parent too if you're not already. And like you said when we were planning this, G, times change. There's stuff that we know now that like 20 or 30 years ago, whenever you were a kid or however old you are, would have been revolutionary thinking. And now it's just commonly accepted knowledge. So looking at the past with eyes of the present can be a very dangerous, you can almost be digging the well for yourself. Is that fair, G?
Absolutely.
All right. Cool. Well, what's next, G? We've got fight for freedom from the past, and then
So you get out of the hole,
Yeah.
right? And then you got to pick yourself up and move forward.
Correct.
Right? And so what does that look like in your life? And I just want you to think about freedom in this way, right? Like most people most people in this country reap the fruit of freedom.
Yes.
Right? But you have to understand that somebody sowed a seed for that. Right? And the same way in your family, if you're like, maybe you're reaping the fruit of freedom in your life. I know that I am. Like, I'm reaping the fruit of freedom, and some of this fruit is, I didn't plant this fruit.
Yeah.
Like, my family planted this fruit, and these seeds, and I'm reaping the fruit of that. But also, I'm planting seeds of freedom that my children and my grandchildren are going to plant. So just understand that it's a constantly replanting and reharvesting for freedom to happen in your life and in your family's life.
Right. And that's the fight for freedom that we're talking about, where we said that you have to fight for it. It's not going to happen by default. We always like to say today matters on this podcast.
Yeah.
And when you start to have a vision that the palace that you're building for tomorrow, you have to lay a brick today. Right? It's not going to take care of itself. So like all these little things that you do that are daily practices are so important, because like you said, these are the seeds that you're sowing so people can enjoy the fruit tomorrow. So we broke it down into 3 different areas.
Yeah. So in that analogy of the seeds and the fruit, what are some seeds that we can plant for freedom?
Yeah. All right. Well, very first one, G, of course, we said spirit.
Yeah. And so in the spirit, what are those seeds? Here's the seeds that you need to plant. Like, if you want to understand who you are spiritually, you've got to know who God made you to be.
Yes.
That God breathed the breath of life into you, that he made you with a purpose, that he deposited a piece of himself inside of you. And so if you want to know who he is, if you want to have faith to live the life that he's called you to live, well, faith comes by hearing,
Yes.
and hearing by the word of God. You've got to spend time in the Bible reading your word. There's no other way for you to understand the voice of God in your life and to hear the voice of God in your life if you're not reading the Bible. Doesn't matter how many sermons you listen to, right? You listen to all the greatest sermons and you'll have all the head knowledge, right? But you yourself have to open the word up and let God speak to you, right? Like, not God speak to your pastor, but let God speak to you. And that happens from you reading the Bible yourself.
Yeah. It's amazing how basic that is, and that we have to even say that. But it's like the equivalent of saying, hey, I'm going to get really jacked. I'm going to get buff. Well, how are you going to do it? I'm going to watch a bunch of YouTube videos of other people working out. Like, no chance. You got to get in and you got to pay your price and put the time in, right? It's that simple.
Absolutely. And then what else besides reading the Bible?
Well, prayer, obviously, right? I mean, and prayer is where you really get to learn the voice of God and learn what it feels like to be impressed on by the Holy Spirit. And the more you do that, you've said it before, G, the more you get to know somebody's voice, the easier it is to recognize. I think you gave an example on this podcast once of like Max Lucado or somebody that you like, John Maxwell.
I'm John Maxwell. Like, if you want to understand, if you want to hear God's voice, right? Like, if you want to understand what he sounds like in your life, well, you're going to understand what his voice sounds like by hearing his word.
Yeah.
Right. And until you do that, it won't make sense to you. It's like if you read all of John Maxwell's books, if you know who he is, and I love John Maxwell, but he has like 40 different books. And to me, some of them sound very similar. And that's not a negative thing, right?
Yeah.
He has a lot of the same
voice.
message,
Yeah.
right? And the Bible's like that, right? Written by, dozens of different people across thousands of years. But in the same way, you hear a lot of the same thing,
Yeah.
right? So I say that to say, if you read all of John Maxwell's books, you'd never seen him before, you don't know what he looked like, but you went to a conference, and because he has a very distinct message, you'd be like, man, that's John Maxwell.
Yep.
And that's kind of what it's like to understand the voice of the Lord in your life.
Right.
Like, if you know who he is, and you'll learn that by reading the Bible, if you know who he is, when he's speaking, you'll be like, man, that's God's voice.
Yes.
Like, you won't have this struggle that so many, and don't be offended by this, but then you won't have this struggle that so many immature Christians have. Are like, well, man, is that my God? Is that my voice or God's voice?
Yes.
Like, if you're struggling to understand the difference between your voice and God's voice, you need to spend more time in the Word of God.
Boom. Next up, mind. And you're going to hear a few things that you've heard before, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about daily disciplines for your mind. Gratitude. We've got a podcast on that. Meditation. We've never done a full podcast on that, but we do a gratitude meditation from Tony Robbins daily, which is phenomenal. Reading, right? This is where it's not the substitute for the Bible, but read personal growth and development books. You were made to personally grow and develop. God gave you a rule of dominion. This is how you're going to develop it. And vision. I cannot talk enough about vision. We've done a whole podcast on that as well.
Yes, just go. If we go down that road, it will take a long time. So just go listen to the podcast on vision, because this episode really is like a reminder for you to be constantly planting the seeds of freedom in your life. Because if you don't, you're sowing seeds of bondage for your children.
Yeah.
Go back and listen to the episode on vision and understand how important this is for you seeing a future in your life, and that'll make you a great sower.
Yeah. And for all these things, the same way that you don't expect to get, like I said, to get in good shape by working out once, or you don't eat only once a day, you eat multiple times and you eat every day. All these things, that's why we're saying daily practices. This should not feel like a burden. If it is, it's probably because you're not very good at organization and time management. Realistically, you should be able to put these things in place and plug them into holes in your schedule so that it's not a burden. It's like, okay, this is my half hour where I go exercise. This is my 45 minutes in the morning with the Lord, whatever it may be. This is when I meditate. And if you put all those things in place, it's amazing how you can start stacking that. And next thing you know, your life looks all different.
Absolutely. And then we got one more category that you need to be planting seed in, right? In this, because this is another area that you can fall into bondage, and that's in your body.
Very easy to overlook.
Don't think that you're doing anybody a favor, that you're doing your family a favor by working so hard that you work yourself into poor health.
Yeah.
Right? Pastor Keith says the best gift that you can give somebody is a healthy you.
Yeah.
Right? And so like that's freedom. Like you're sowing seeds of freedom for yourself, and you're giving your family the ability for you to be a sower for the long term.
Yeah.
Right. So don't think like, man, I'm just going to like work so hard, work 14 hours a day, be overweight, become diseased, all of this stuff. Like you're not being a martyr for your family, and that's a good thing.
Right.
Right. You are weakening yourself and ruining your ability to serve your family in a long-term way. So you've got to have vision. Then you got to do the work of rest, of nutrition, of exercise. And these are things that we do all the time. This is not a one-time thing.
Yeah. I couldn't really say it any better myself, G. I think there's a great quote that talks about health. Health is the first wealth. Ralph Waldo Emerson,
Yeah.
right? And it truly is. It's the one thing that can render all other wealth completely useless.
It's the one thing that when you have all the wealth in the world and you don't have it, you'll give it up to get your health back.
Yeah, exactly. All right, G, I think we're going to wrap there and let people go out and celebrate freedom. What's the challenge for the people?
My challenge to everyone is to continue to be a sower of freedom in your family.
Yes.
And if you're someone who's been born into bondage, right? And we all have a form of, at a minimum, we've all been born into like the bondage of sin.
Yeah.
Right. But think about the areas that you've been born into bondage in, and the ways that you are going to even, maybe I was born into bondage, but I'm sowing seeds of, and I may not reap a lot of fruit of freedom in my life, but I'm going to make sure I sow seeds of freedom for my children.